U.S. contractors in Iraq were called to help fellow Americans after a suicide bombing.
And on the way to extract them, the Iraqi police opened fire on us.
When Iraqi civilians were killed in the firefight, 4 Americans were charged as war criminals, 1 convicted of murder. But then
one of the news feeds said we were pardoned.
You mean you just read it on a news feed?
No, I read it on a note. One of the other prisoners slid a note under my door, and I opened it up, and it's like 4 Blackwater contractors pardoned by President Trump.
This week, a personal story told for the first time of a long journey home.
And we go to the city some call the capital of COVID fraud.
How was it so big then?
Some pretty lavish shopping sprees with money that was meant to go back into the economy by making payroll and by helping small businesses.
If you had to describe the scope of it, are there numbers to back up how big it is?
It's going to be in the billions.
What happens back there, they have everything from milk and baby bottles, shampoo, Pampers, anything and everything the family might need.
And in this season of giving, we visit one giant effort that's bringing charity into the border crisis. Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. The holidays are a special time for many of us, but for some, life events make them even sweeter. This holiday season, we have a complicated story involving tragedy, a former soldier, accusations of murder, and a journey with an unexpected ending.
This is a story about a man that went to war for his country and basically was sacrificed for politics.
To be sure, Nick Slatten's version of his own story, told here in his first television interview, isn't shared by everyone.
My brothers and I, there was 4 of us total that were sacrificed.
Slatten is a decorated former Army sniper. After 2 combat tours in Iraq, he was hired by a company called Blackwater to work on a U.S. rescue team in Iraq. It was codenamed Raven 2-3. On September 16, 2007, there was a terrorist suicide bombing attack on Americans, and Raven 2-3 got called in to help.
So we're tasked with going to extract them. And on the way to extract them, the Iraqi police opened fire on us. And so this was a normal thing. We had been in many engagements with Iraqi army and Iraqi police. You know, one day they're a cop, the next day they're an insurgent. So it just depends on which faction they're loyal to.
14 Iraqis, including 2 young boys, were shot and killed in the firefight. Slatten and the team insisted they'd been ambushed and acted in self-defense. Prosecutors and the FBI said the team opened fire on innocent civilians. The relentless pursuit of criminal charges against Slatten and his teammates spanned 3 presidential administrations. They were charged, but the charges were dropped due to misconduct by prosecutors. Then they were recharged, tried, and convicted in a joint trial. For 3 convicted of manslaughter, a judge later found their 30-year prison sentences to be excessive and threw them out. Ultimately, their time was cut in half. Nick Slatten's path was even more complicated. How many trials did you have?
3.
Originally charged with manslaughter, the time limit or statute of limitations on that charge expired, and prosecutors levied a more serious charge, first-degree murder. They alleged that Slatten fired the first shot that day. A jury found him guilty, but a judge tossed out the conviction on appeal because Slatten had been unfairly barred from telling the jury that someone else had admitted firing the first shot. Then trial number 2 ended in a hung jury. Slatten insists his prosecutions were politically motivated, with U.S. officials scapegoating Raven 2-3 as part of sensitive negotiations with Iraq. Meantime, he turned down offers for deals for freedom, he says, in exchange for admitting guilt.
The government offers me a deal for 5 years, which is essentially time served. I had almost served that amount of time. So basically they're saying, admit that you did wrong and you can just walk out the door. And I refused.
At trial number 3, the jury found Slatten guilty of first-degree murder, and he got a life sentence. An end to the court drama, but the beginning of a new chapter. This one started in May 2019 with what Slatten describes as a supernatural experience when he was locked down in his prison cell during a riot.
And then immediately I hear a voice, and it sounds like it's coming from the speaker box that's in the cell where you can push a button, a panic button, basically, if anything's happening. And it says, "Slatten, pack your stuff, you got a presidential pardon." And so I'm like, man, I'm going crazy. I ain't had enough food, something's wrong with me. And so they finally let us out of our cells a few days after that. And I called my sister, and she's like, "Have you talked to anybody?" I said, "No, I've been locked down." She said, "Well, the New York Times reported that President Trump is considering pardoning soldiers accused of war crimes. And it mentioned you by name. And that article was dated the exact day that I heard the voice." So I'm like, I tell my sister, I said, "God told me I'm going to get pardoned." She's like, "Yeah, whatever, bro. You know, you're going crazy."
From that day on, Slatten says, he felt a calm assurance that there would be a pardon. He started getting letters of support, including from a woman in his Tennessee hometown who believed him innocent. A year and a half later, 3 days before Christmas last year, the pardon came.
And this little jail had like tablets that you could rent. And one of the news feeds said we were pardoned.
You mean you just read it on a news feed?
No, I read it on a note. One of the other prisoners slid a note under my door, and I opened it up, and it's like 4 Blackwater contractors pardoned by President Trump. And I was like, and so my buddy had a tablet in the cell. I was like, "Look at this." And he was like, "That's you, man." He pulled it up, and he's like, "Here." My cellmate, he was pretty crazy. He made an announcement, like they do that all the time in jail. He's like, "Listen up," you know, and everybody gets quiet. He's like, "My man here just got pardoned by President Trump." And so the prisoners started, you know, kicking the doors and yelling and stuff.
So how long from the time you got word that a pardon had come until you actually walked out free?
It was like an hour and a half.
President Trump pardoned murderers.
Outrage that President Trump would pardon these 4 former Blackwater guards.
How did you feel when you heard, or maybe you just knew this, a lot of people were arguing when the pardon came that you guys didn't deserve it, that they were letting killers go free?
So those were the people that never actually looked into our case, that never actually read the trial.
Slatten returned to his home here in Tennessee, and he says it wasn't long before he began turning his attention to others.
I started learning that there were other soldiers, sailors, and Marines and airmen in similar situations that basically were locked up for making a split-second decision in combat. And I always said that if the Lord saw fit to let me out, that I would fight for him. You know, I believe that if our men and women go to war, we should have their back, no matter what. They should never have to choose between a casket or a prison cell. And I saw that a lot over there. These young soldiers were afraid to engage because if they got it wrong, they would go to prison. And they got killed because of it. I mean, it's just crazy.
One of those he's fighting for is Calvin Gibbs, who's serving life in prison for 3 murders in Afghanistan.
So what drew me to Staff Sergeant Gibbs' case was the fact that he refused to plead guilty, same as I did. So they offered him a deal. He wouldn't take it. He said, "I didn't murder anybody. I didn't execute anybody," right? And so Staff Sergeant Calvin Gibbs is just one that I can hold up. Like, I've talked to him. He's my friend. He's my brother. I love him. He's actually innocent, and he's serving a life sentence, and nobody knows his name.
There are people who would argue what sets us apart is if we make a mistake, even in a split-second decision, and civilians are killed, we hold ours accountable. That's what's special about this country, and that's important to do.
Right. So I would say that those people have never been shot at. They've never seen their friends blown up by a vehicle-borne IED or never seen a rocket come in. We got rocketed all the time. And it wasn't just combat soldiers that were getting hit. So it's like there's such this double standard that our soldiers are held up to this impossible standard of you're fighting an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform. It can be an 8-year-old boy to a 75-year-old woman. So you never know who's going to blow you up. You never know who's going to shoot at you.
In the years since his release, Slatten has been making up for lost time. That hometown girl who wrote to him in prison, he married her, And today he claims the accusations, the 3 trials, the years in prison all changed him for the better, helping heal a soldier who'd come back from war a broken man.
You know, God gave me a time out, so to speak. He did what any good dad would do. And, you know, thank God President Trump stepped in and pardoned me because I was supposed to die in prison. You know, I've been richly blessed. I've got a wife and a newborn daughter now, so yeah, things are good.
Slatten is among those pressing for Congress to pass what they call post-war amnesty for accused former soldiers who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Ahead on Full Measure, the capital of COVID fraud. Billions of dollars have been lost to COVID relief fraud across the country, but one city eclipses all the others, according to the FBI, Miami, Florida, dubbed the capital of COVID fraud. Scott Thuman reports.
White, sandy beaches and swaying palm trees, Miami has become one of the nation's hotspots for luxury lifestyles. But some wanting to feed that first-class life are cutting corners and breaking the law. Miami has become ground zero for COVID relief fraud.
I was doing some Googling, and the first phrase I put in was COVID relief fraud, and the word Florida popped up next on its own.
Yes.
Jay Bernardo is the FBI's assistant special agent in charge, leading the COVID-19 fraud investigations in South Florida.
If you had to describe the scope of it, are there numbers to back up how big it is?
Not yet, because it's still ongoing. As we speak, some of these programs are still open and operational. It's going to be in the billions.
The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, was signed in March of 2020. It was supposed to provide emergency financial assistance to millions of Americans suffering from hard times brought by the pandemic. And South Florida became the fraud capital.
Why is it so popular here?
Miami is a financial hub in and out of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, as well as a gateway, physical hub, so people are always coming through here. They use all the banking system here for South America. It's a very transient population.
We've prosecuted over 40 cases relating to CARES Act fraud. The loss amount associated with those cases is $75 to $100 million.
That's just in 40 cases?
That's just in 40 cases.
Dia Nathan is an assistant United States attorney. She's part of the Department of Justice's task force in charge of prosecuting COVID-related fraud.
How is it so big then?
Well, some of the cases involve preparers, for example, who have filed over 100 applications seeking a total of $25 million or higher in benefits. We have an individual who got, just one person, $3.9 million in fraudulently obtained loan proceeds from the PPP program. Actually, to date, our office has seized over $20 million in assets relating to CARES Act fraud. So that's money and assets that we got back and that we can return to the federal government.
What kind of assets?
Most of what we've seized so far has been money in bank accounts, cash, jewelry, cars. There is some real property that we're working on seizing as well. But real property, I mean houses. Mm-hmm. We've seen some unique cases in our district. We've seen some of our defendants allegedly spend funds on $300,000 Lamborghinis, on clothing purchases at Christian Dior, at Louis Vuitton, at Gucci, on gambling, $50,000 plus at a casino. So these expenditures were well outside of the intent of the programs.
So some pretty lavish shopping sprees, it sounds like.
Some pretty lavish shopping sprees with money that was meant to go back into the economy by making payroll and by helping small businesses, not by buying cars.
NFL player Joshua Bellamy has been charged with stealing $1.2 million through the Paycheck Protection Program. Hassan Brown pled guilty to helping steal $24 million of COVID relief money by using stolen identities and shell companies he initially intended to commit bank fraud with. According to the Department of Justice, the money's being stolen in 3 key ways. Business owners inflate payroll expenses to get larger loans through the Paycheck Protection Program. Serial fraud, applying for loans using dormant corporations and shell companies to apply for multiple loans. And lastly, organized criminal networks.
We've seen a lot of the violent gangs here in the area funding their lifestyle through COVID-related fraud. So instead of what your typical drugs and guns, they're using financial crime as a way to profit and perpetuate their lifestyle and their gang activity. So we have started a task force here this summer to try and address that.
What kind of punishment do they face?
Generally, we're charging these defendants with wire fraud or bank fraud or conspiracies to commit those crimes. They're looking at 20 years per count. So many of them are charged with multiple counts. They could face over 20 years for the crime at large.
What's the future? Do you see this getting better, getting worse, growing, or eventually dissipating as COVID has in some ways?
We are continuing to investigate these cases. The fraud is ongoing in the sense that people are still spending ill-gotten gains. People are still living off of ill-gotten gains. So there is a reason to continue to prosecute these cases.
Is there a message out of all of this? Is there a warning, if you will, that the FBI is trying to send out to people?
We don't stop, we don't forget, and we won't quit. So it's a formidable force, and it'll take us a while, but we'll get to them.
Where are all the leads coming from for these cases?
Well, surprisingly, according to the FBI, a majority of the tips they get are from leads that have been called in from everyday people who saw something and reported it. What's different is in past years, they would get maybe a few hundred tips on financial fraud cases. This past year, 150,000 plus have come specific only to the CARES Act financial fraud.
That's amazing. Thanks a lot, Scott. Coming up on Full Measure, illegal immigrants, the southern border, and a nun. As the border crisis continues, the feds are still releasing large numbers of COVID-infected illegal border crossers into the U.S. That leaves local communities and charities scrambling to act. One charity group is playing a bigger role than any other. Catholic Charities takes in many families with children after Border Patrol releases them in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. It's the busiest place in the nation for illegal immigration. Sister Norma Pimentel shows us the giant facility she runs by a bus station in McAllen.
Getting buses arrive at from 7 in the morning all the way to midnight. What you see here in this room, which is the main room that we have, is in this area right here is when the newly arrivals, they sit in the blue chairs and they wait to be called so that they can talk to their family and start to make arrangements for their travel with their family members. What happens back there, they have everything from milk and baby bottles, shampoo, Pampers, anything and everything the family might need.
But they spend an average of one night here?
For the most part, everybody will not go beyond 24 hours.
Do most of the people already have family here?
I would say 99% of the time, with the exception of almost 1 in 1,000, but for the most part, we don't see somebody that does not have family here.
Sister Norma Pimentel says at first her group was putting up COVID-infected families at local hotels. But so many arrived over the summer, local organizers faced an emergency and had to devise a new plan.
They set it outside here within the city, and the following day, I think they re-looked at the situation and saw that this could definitely grow to a larger amount that needed definitely a better space where we can. So it was all, by the second day, the setup was then at Ansalduas Park, which is a place outside in Mission. So the whole operation just moved there. Everybody was dropped there. They were tested. If they were positive, they would remain there. If they were negative, they were brought over here.
People are hearing that people are crossing in with COVID and it kind of frightens them. If people say Why should we, when we're trying to be so careful, be bringing other people in that have it?
I agree. I can understand the concern of our community being worried about the fact that some of these families have COVID, and if I would be alarmed if I thought that they were walking around our community, exposing everybody. Precisely why I took the proper measures to make sure that that wasn't going to happen, that we would responsibly make sure these families who were arriving, they were released to us, that they would be isolated and they would be in a place where they could be cared for, and at the same time not exposing our community to the virus. They're people just like us, they're families, mothers and fathers struggling to take care of their children, and that side is not related when you just label them as illegals entering our country and spreading the virus. If they're here, if they're in our community already, I think these families need to be properly cared for correctly and not just simply discarded or put aside because as if they were not humans. They are people, and it breaks my heart. And anyone that comes and sees them, that see that child, that mother, and how they're struggling, it only moves us to want to help.
You have a system here, but there was no system set up by Border Patrol, to test and control. And I wonder what's happening in other places, or what happened prior to someone like you being able to set up a system.
My hope is that other locations like ours that are receiving immigrants from the Border Patrol are also responsibly responding to handle and process and help the families correctly for the good of the refugees and for the good of the community. And that's my hope, that they are also doing what I'm doing,
Catholic Charities is funded by donations and government funds. They figure they've helped somewhere on the order of 250,000 immigrants who crossed illegally from Mexico since 2014. After a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? Coming up next week on Full Measure, the botched U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan may be creating a new alliance between Islamic extremist terrorists, the Taliban, and those in Iran and Pakistan. That's impacting America's strategic position in the Mideast and our long-standing ally, Israel.
One of the new sets of threats is from a new generation of militants coming from a wide array of countries.
We're reporting from Israel on the instability facing our allies next week on Full Measure. Now there are several ways to watch Full Measure from home or on the go. To watch full episodes, just download our Stir app on your phone or on your Roku, Apple TV, or Fire. And if you want to hear more stories, check out our podcast, Full Measure After Hours, on your favorite distributor. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable. Thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.